Some mornings feel like any other. You wake, you pack, you move through a world that assumes nothing extraordinary will happen. But some mornings carry a weight you don't yet understand, like a whisper in the air, a pause between heartbeats. That morning, Isaiah Lewis stood beneath the vast glass windows of Sacramento International Airport. The early sunlight painted long, golden streaks across the tarmac, touching the tips of jet wings like a quiet blessing. He wore a slate gray hoodie, a pair of clean sneakers, and a look in his eyes that didn't seek attention, but held it nonetheless. In his right hand, he carried a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. In his left, his phone and digital boarding pass. Row 14A, window seat, direct to Phoenix, with a short layover before home in Atlanta. Isaiah was 16, tall for his age, with soft brown skin and a patient stare that often made adults uncomfortable. Not because he was rude, but because he saw more than he let on. And his classmates sometimes called him the Whisper because he rarely raised his voice. But his grandmother had a different name for him, My Oak Tree. You don't have to move fast to be strong, she told him the week before, wincing through the pain of her knee surgery. You just have to stand your ground. He had flown to Pennsylvania to care for her after the procedure, helped her in and out of the bath, cooked her oatmeal just the way she liked it, and organized her pillbox by day and time. He trimmed her rose bushes and read to her from a book of Baldwin essays, which she loved even though she always fell asleep halfway through. Thank you, baby, she whispered one night as he adjusted the blanket over her frail legs, for treating me like I still matter. Now at gate B203, Isaiah stood quietly, replaying that moment in his mind. Around him, the world rushed on. Flight announcements echoed. Business people scrolled through spreadsheets. A child spilled a juice box on the floor. But Isaiah remained still, as if listening for something the others couldn't hear. He stepped onto the jet bridge, his heartbeat slow and steady. The smell of jet fuel mixed with coffee drifted past. He gave a polite nod to the first flight attendant he saw, a woman with tightly pulled blonde hair and a uniform too crisp for comfort. She didn't smile back. Instead, she glanced at his hoodie, his skin, his bag, and looked through him. A flicker, barely a second. But Isaiah had learned to recognize these glances, the kind that weigh you before they welcome you. Still, he walked on. Seat 14A was his, and no one would convince him otherwise. Inside the plane, the cabin was already half full. Passengers adjusted seatbelts, lifted carry-ons into overhead bins. A row of executives whispered over tablets, and a couple argued quietly over which armrest belonged to whom. Isaiah glanced at his phone again. Seat 14A, still green, still his. When he arrived at the row, someone was already seated there, a man in his mid-30s with headphones on, sipping from a thermos. Isaiah hesitated for a second, then turned to the aisle. "Excuse me," he said softly to the nearest flight attendant. "I believe someone's in my seat." The attendant was the same woman from earlier. Sandra Whitlow, her name tag read. She stopped mid-stride, turned, and looked him up and down. "What's the problem?" Isaiah kept his voice calm. "My boarding pass says seat 14A, but it looks like someone's already there." She didn't ask to see the pass, didn't glance at his phone. Instead, her lips tightened. "That's not your seat." A silence fell around them. Not loud, not dramatic, just the kind that makes you suddenly aware of every pair of eyes nearby. Isaiah blinked. "Sorry, ma'am, but it is. I just double-checked." "You're supposed to be in the back," she snapped. "I don't care what your phone says. You're not assigned here." Isaiah's pulse quickened, but his voice remained even. "Could you please scan it to check? I'm sure it's correct." Her nostrils flared. "Don't argue with me, young man. Either take the seat I tell you, or you're off this plane." Off the plane. Just like that. A boy with a smile too polite. A backpack is too small. A voice too soft to be a threat. And yet the aisle closed in on him like a noose tightening. Isaiah could feel the heat rise in his cheeks, not from guilt, but from the sheer humiliation of being told he did not belong. The whispers started. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else reached for a phone. He stood frozen between dignity and dismissal. That's when his grandmother's words came back to him. "You just have to stand your ground." Without another word to Sandra, Isaiah stepped back into the aisle, lifted his phone, and dialed a number he knew by heart. It rang once, then a voice low and steady on the other end. "This is Malcolm," Isaiah whispered. "Uncle, I need you." Malcolm Lewis didn't ask questions. Not at first. He didn't need to. He recognized the quiet urgency in his nephew's voice, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any cry for help. "Where are you?" he asked calmly. "Flight 4729, Blue Air, Gate B23, Sacramento to Phoenix," Isaiah replied, trying to keep his voice low. He turned slightly in the aisle, angling his shoulder away from Sandra Whitlow's line of sight. "She won't check my pass. She says I belong in the back." "Have you raised your voice?" "No." "Good," Malcolm said. His voice was like a metronome, steady, controlled, as if built to keep people grounded. "Keep your phone on. Don't provoke. Just record. Let me do the rest." Isaiah lowered the phone slightly and glanced down at his screen. His camera app was already open. One swipe, and it began to capture everything. His trembling fingers, the calm cabin buzz, and the occasional glance of a passenger pretending not to look. He hadn't moved from his place in the aisle. Not yet. His boarding pass still clutched in one hand, phone in the other. Sandra Whitlow stood a few feet away, muttering something into her walkie-talkie. Her tone was performative, sharp and theatrical, like someone rehearsing authority instead of exercising it. "I have a non-compliant passenger," she announced. "Young male, refusing to follow seating instructions, might need removal." Isaiah flinched. The words rang out like a false alarm, loud enough to plant fear, but vague enough to twist the truth. Around him, passengers stirred. One man looked up from his newspaper. A woman glanced over the top of her Kindle. Nobody spoke, except one. "He hasn't even sat down yet," a soft voice murmured from the opposite aisle. Isaiah didn't catch the face, just the comment, and the courage behind it. Sandra didn't respond. She walked briskly toward the front of the cabin, vanishing behind the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the world. Isaiah could hear the tension in the air thickening, even as the engines outside whined quietly in preparation for departure. He looked down at his phone again. "You still there, Uncle?" "I've already contacted Blue Air Legal," Malcolm replied. "I'll be on with their director in 5 minutes. Just stay calm, and whatever you do, don't leave that seat unchallenged." Isaiah nodded instinctively, though no one could see it. A few seconds later, Sandra reappeared, a scowl carved into her face like stone. Her walkie crackled. "This is Captain Rayner. What's the status?" "Passengers still refusing to comply," she answered, casting Isaiah a look like he was a delinquent instead of a 16-year-old with a boarding pass. "Permission to have him escorted off." The words sank into Isaiah's chest like cold water. He had done everything right, spoken respectfully, followed procedure, and remained calm. And still he was a problem. Still he was seen not as a young man, but as a threat. And yet he stood his ground. "I'd like to speak with someone else," Isaiah said, loud enough to be heard but measured enough not to challenge. "Someone who can scan my pass." A pause. Sandra froze, visibly thrown off by his poise. And then, like a quiet tide washing in, another presence appeared. An older flight attendant, with salt and pepper hair and kind, watchful eyes. His name tag read G. Norrell. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if aware that every step mattered. "Son," he said gently, "may I see your boarding pass?" Isaiah handed it over without a word. Norrell took out a small handheld scanner, pressed a button, and waited. A single beep, then another. He looked at the screen for a few seconds, his brow furrowing, not with confusion, but with concern. "You were reassigned," he said quietly, showing Isaiah the screen. "Gate reissued seating before boarding. You're exactly where you're supposed to be, row 14A. Isaiah exhaled for the first time in minutes. Sandra marched toward them, already mid-sentence. "That can't be right. My manifest shows—" Norrell held up a hand, his voice still calm. "It's updated. He belongs here. You'll find his name listed now." Passengers around them leaned in. A few nodded. One began quietly recording again. Sandra's face flushed a deep, angry red. She looked between Norrell and the scanner. Her jaw clenched tight. Then, without another word, she turned and stormed down the aisle toward the galley. Isaiah stood motionless. "You handled that well," Norel said. "Most adults don't keep their cool like you did." Isaiah gave him a small, tight smile. "My grandmother taught me better than to yell when I can speak." Norel patted him lightly on the shoulder and stepped aside. Isaiah slid into seat 14A, the window seat that had been his all along. He placed his duffel at his feet and sat up straight, phone still in hand, camera still running. Outside, the sun continued to rise. Inside, Isaiah wasn't celebrating. He wasn't smiling. He was simply breathing deep, quiet breaths that pushed away the knot in his chest. Across the aisle, someone whispered, "Good for him." Behind him, a woman whispered to her husband, "He was so respectful. Why would she treat him like that?" Isaiah didn't turn around. He didn't need validation. He didn't need applause. But somewhere deep inside him, something began to shift. Not anger, not fear, just clarity. The seat felt colder than Isaiah expected. Or maybe it was the weight in his chest that made everything around him feel distant, like he was underwater, hearing life through layers of muted pressure. He adjusted his backpack at his feet, sat upright in 14A, and stared blankly out the window. The tarmac stretched before him in soft glimmers of morning light. Planes taxied lazily across the runway, unaware that, inside this cabin, a storm had passed and another was quietly forming. His phone buzzed against his thigh. A message from his uncle Malcolm. "Stay seated. I'm escalating." Isaiah didn't reply. He didn't need to. Instead, he glanced down the aisle where Sandra Whitlow had disappeared. Somewhere behind the galley curtain, she was likely regrouping, stewing in silent fury. And yet, even though he had been proven right, boarding pass scanned, seat confirmed, he didn't feel vindicated. Not yet, because the damage had already been done. The hum of the cabin returned gradually. Passengers resumed half-hearted conversations. A magazine flipped. A cough echoed. Someone restarted a podcast. But there was a subtle shift in the air now, like the moments after an argument when people pretend they hadn't just witnessed something ugly. And then came the voice. Clear, firm. From 4 rows ahead, a young woman stood slowly, her yellow hoodie almost glowing under the cabin lights. Her hair was tied up in a loose bun, a simple tote bag tucked under her seat. She turned, one hand resting lightly on the seat in front of her for balance. "If anyone recorded what just happened," she said, "don't delete it." Every head turned. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It carried, not just through the air, but through the tension, through the silence, through the guilt. "Keep it. The truth matters," she added. Then she sat back down without waiting for a reaction. Isaiah's heart kicked in his chest. He hadn't realized how tightly he'd been holding his breath. Something in the way she said it, not with rage but with purpose, made the cabin pulse with new energy. Around him, a ripple began to move. Phones were lifted, eyes met. Passengers looked not at him, but around themselves, at each other, as if waking up to a shared responsibility. The hush had been broken, and in its place came quiet acknowledgement. The woman's voice had been a match, and the cabin was kindling. Sandra re-emerged from the galley moments later, her posture stiffer than before. Her eyes scanned the rows, locking briefly on Isaiah's face. But he didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He simply looked back, steady, composed, unshaken. She broke the gaze first. Just as she turned away, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rayner speaking," came the calm, practiced voice of authority. "We've been advised of an issue requiring attention before departure. We will be returning to the gate momentarily." The plane slowed. The engines softened. The hum that signaled imminent takeoff now reversed itself, a soft growl as the aircraft pivoted back toward the terminal. Gasps, murmurs, heads turning. A man in a suit leaned forward to whisper to his neighbor, "Is this because of—" Yes, it was. Isaiah felt something shift in his spine. Not pride, not triumph, but something sturdier. Belonging. For the first time in what felt like hours, he allowed his shoulders to relax, just slightly. A flight attendant, one Isaiah hadn't seen before, stepped quietly into his row. She was younger, her bronze skin glowing under the soft lighting. Her hands were clasped in front of her, trembling slightly. She crouched down to Isaiah's level and leaned in. "I saw what happened," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. That should never have happened to you." He turned to her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. She wasn't performing. She wasn't trying to cover for the company. She was simply human. Isaiah gave a small nod. "Thank you. You handled it better than most grown-ups would have," she added, her eyes wet. Isaiah didn't respond immediately. His throat felt tight. Instead, he gave her a faint, grateful smile, and she rose and stepped away just as quietly as she had come. The cabin door opened with a hiss of pressure. Two uniformed airport security officers stepped on board, flanking a woman in a sharp navy blazer. Her walk was measured, intentional. Her name badge read L. Monroe, Blue Air Cabin Operations Supervisor. Passengers craned their necks. The woman's heels clicked softly against the floor as she moved down the aisle. She stopped at row 14. "Mr. Lewis?" she asked. Isaiah nodded. "I'll speak with you in a moment," she said gently. "But first," her tone sharpened, shifting like a blade being unsheathed. "Ms. Whitlow." Sandra, who had been halfway down the aisle, stiffened. "Please come with us to the front of the cabin." Dead silence. Sandra froze. She looked from Monroe to the passengers. Her eyes flicked almost desperately toward Isaiah, but he didn't look away. She turned without protest and followed the officers to the front of the plane, shoulders rigid, chin raised as if trying to preserve the last fragments of control. Behind her, the woman in the yellow hoodie muttered just loud enough, "About time." No one laughed, but no one disagreed. Isaiah leaned back in his seat. His hands were no longer shaking. The air felt clearer now, less weighted. The storm hadn't passed, not fully, but it had cracked. The silence that followed was no longer tense. It was waiting. Isaiah sat still, though the seat beneath him felt unsteady, as if the entire cabin were now balanced on the edge of something that had just begun to shift. Passengers whispered, still processing what they'd seen. Some exchanged glances, equal parts discomfort and solidarity. Others checked their phones, watching the signal flicker as the plane idled at the gate. No one had left their seats. It was as though every person had silently agreed to stay put, bearing witness to the aftermath of a confrontation they could no longer pretend hadn't happened. The woman in the navy blazer returned, alone this time. She stopped at Isaiah's row once more. This time she knelt. Not because she had to, but because she understood how power should behave when it is being held accountable. "Mr. Lewis," she said gently, her tone low enough that only those nearby could hear, "I want to offer my sincere apology for what happened to you today." Isaiah looked at her, his face unreadable. "Flight Attendant Whitlow will not be continuing with this flight," the woman continued, "and I assure you, this situation is being addressed at the highest level. You should never have been spoken to that way. You were right to hold your ground." He blinked slowly, then asked the only question that mattered to him in that moment, his voice soft but unshakable. "Why did it take a phone call to be heard?" The supervisor exhaled. Her lips parted slightly, then closed again. She didn't dodge, didn't deflect. "Sometimes it takes one voice to wake everyone else up," she said quietly. Isaiah didn't nod. He didn't offer forgiveness. He simply let the words land. Because he wasn't angry in the way people expected. He wasn't looking for revenge or spectacle. What he wanted, what so many like him wanted, was to be seen before being judged, to be trusted without needing a lawyer on the phone, to have a seat that didn't come with suspicion. Captain Rayner's voice returned over the intercom. "Thank you for your patience. We're addressing a personnel issue and will resume boarding shortly. You may stretch your legs, but please stay near your assigned seats." Still, no one moved. In Isaiah's chest, a throb of exhaustion pulsed like a second heartbeat. The rush of adrenaline had passed, but something deeper had taken root, a growing awareness that the world was watching, now, and possibly for a long time to come. Just as he leaned back to rest, a quiet tap came at his shoulder. It was the young flight attendant from earlier, the one with kind eyes and a trembling voice. She handed him a slip of paper. It wasn't an incident report. It was a seat reassignment. "Mr. Lewis," she said softly, "we'd like to move you to 2A for the rest of the flight." Isaiah stared at it. "First class." He looked past her toward the curtain, then glanced at the rows behind him. Passengers watching with cautious empathy. A few smiled. One gave a subtle nod. "I'm fine here," Isaiah replied, not unkindly. "I don't want special treatment." She shook her head gently. "It's not a reward, it's just quieter up front. And after everything, we thought you might appreciate the space." He hesitated. Part of him wanted to remain where he was, as if that somehow proved something. That dignity didn't require leather seats or curtain dividers. But another part of him, the part that had carried bags for his grandmother and stayed up late refilling her pillbox, understood that peace was a gift worth accepting. He stood slowly, took his bag and walked forward. Each step felt like a contradiction, triumph and burden, relief and weight. It was not a victory lap. It was a silent reckoning. As he passed the woman in the yellow hoodie, she gave him a look, not of pity, but of recognition. And Isaiah gave her the smallest nod in return. One row farther up, a middle-aged man placed a hand over his chest in a quiet salute. A subtle gesture, a shared understanding. At 2A, Isaiah placed his backpack beneath the seat and sat down. The cushion was softer, yes. The space is more generous. But the view from the window hadn't changed, and neither had he. He looked back toward the rest of the cabin, separated now by that thin blue curtain. It felt strange, how a fabric less than a centimeter thick could symbolize decades of unspoken division. His phone vibrated again. "Malcolm, she's off the flight. They know this won't be contained." Isaiah didn't respond. Instead, he watched the ramp workers below. He watched a luggage cart roll across the tarmac. He watched the sun climb higher over Sacramento, like nothing had happened, like the world outside had kept moving while his had paused. But inside this aircraft, something had shifted. He reached for his notebook, the small one he always kept in his side pocket. He flipped to a blank page and began to write. Not to post, not to publish, just for himself. "They didn't see me, but I didn't disappear. I stayed still, and the world moved." A few minutes later, a flight attendant returned. She handed him a bottle of water and tucked a small paper towel under it, as if afraid to let it leave a ring on the armrest. She smiled politely and left without a word. Isaiah sipped slowly. Outside, the engines roared again, a low tremble signaling movement. The plane rolled forward, preparing for takeoff. But Isaiah was no longer just going home. He was being carried forward toward something larger than himself. He looked down at the empty seat beside him. Then he looked ahead, toward the runway. And he whispered, not as a question, but as a statement of becoming, "Let them hear me now." At 30,000 feet, silence can be deceiving. The engines hummed steadily beneath the cabin, and the seatbelt sign flickered off. Flight attendants resumed their routine, pushing carts down narrow aisles, offering snacks and drinks like nothing had ever gone wrong. To the casual observer, it might have looked like any other flight. Polite smiles, clinking cans, seat backs tilted to 110 degrees. But Isaiah knew better. So did the people around him. From his new seat in 2A, Isaiah could see the faint outlines of first-class calm, the polished wood tray tables, the linen napkins folded neatly, the illusion of ease. But comfort didn't erase memory. He could still feel the burn of Sandra Whitlow's voice in his ears. He could still see the way passengers avoided his eyes when things first went quiet. And now he could feel something else building, something he hadn't asked for, but couldn't ignore. His phone buzzed again, dozens of times. He finally slid it out from his pocket. 16 messages, 10 missed calls, 3 voicemails, from friends, cousins, even teachers he hadn't spoken to in years. But one message stood out, from Cam, a classmate from his AP English class. "Dude, you're on Twitter. Like, really on it. 30K retweets and climbing. Everyone's talking about you." Isaiah froze. He unlocked his phone and tapped open the browser. His screen filled with a flurry of images, screenshots, video clips, quote tweets. The top one showed a blurry frame of him standing in the aisle, phone to his ear. The caption, "All this kid did was ask for the seat he was assigned. The flight attendant tried to have him removed. He called his lawyer uncle. She got escorted off instead. Meet Isaiah Lewis. Chuck's seat with respect." It had 82,000 likes. Another clip, from a different angle, showed Sandra barking into her walkie-talkie. Her voice is loud. Isaiah's calmness, by contrast, is almost surreal. The camera panned as she was later walked off the plane. Isaiah scrolled further. Comment after comment. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He just stood there. And somehow he was the threat? Imagine needing legal backup to sit in the seat you paid for. In 2025. This isn't a one-off. This is systemic. Blue Air better come correct. A cold shiver moved up Isaiah's spine. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, much less from strangers, celebrities, lawyers, organizers, and public figures now resharing his image like he was a rallying cry. He looked out the window, trying to slow his breathing. This wasn't what he'd wanted. He didn't want to be a symbol or a headline. He just wanted to go home. But home wasn't where the fire was burning. Back in Oakland, his uncle Malcolm was already 3 steps ahead. In a small corner office stacked with case files and unopened mail, Malcolm leaned back in his chair as his assistant Dominique clicked through the viral storm on her laptop. 72,000 shares in under 2 hours, she said. It's exploding. He didn't smile. Are they saying his name? He asked. Almost all of them. Isaiah Lewis. And a few outlets already picked it up. BuzzFlash, Black Right Now, even a national segment preview on The Current. Malcolm's jaw clenched. Then they know we're not backing down. He typed a short message and hit send. Back on the plane, Isaiah's phone pinged again. Say nothing to the press, stay calm, land safely, I've got this. ML Isaiah set the phone down on the fold-out table and let his head rest against the seat. Around him, passengers still cast glances, some furtive, some admiring. The man across the aisle gave him a thumbs up. A college-age woman leaned forward and whispered, "You were amazing back there." He nodded politely, but inwardly a strange hollowness had settled in. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate the support, he did. But he also knew that what had gone viral wasn't just a moment. It was his face, his name, his dignity put on display for public consumption. And now the airline was scrambling. When the plane touched down in Phoenix, Isaiah waited for most of the passengers to deboard. Not because he was shy, but because he didn't want to be met by cameras or chaos. Still, just outside the gate, a young woman in a blazer stood with a clipboard and a practiced PR smile. "Mr. Lewis," she asked, stepping forward, "on behalf of Blue Air, I'd like to personally apologize and offer you a voucher for future flights." She handed him the form, eyes hopeful. Isaiah looked at it. A neat rectangle of corporate apology. $200, as if that could undo humiliation. He stared at her, then quietly asked, "Did you see the video?" She hesitated. "Yes." "And you still think a voucher fixes this?" The smile faltered. She didn't answer. Isaiah handed the form back, turned and walked away. Behind him, a few travelers snapped photos, murmuring to one another. The fire was spreading fast. Back in Atlanta, Trina Lewis, Isaiah's mother, stood in her kitchen watching the news clip replay for the 5th time. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter. She hadn't cried. Not yet. But her knuckles were white. When the door finally opened and Isaiah stepped inside that night, she didn't say a word. She wrapped him in her arms and held on tight. "You okay?" she whispered. "I'm good," he said. "Not great, but good enough." They didn't talk about the flight. Not yet. Instead, they sat in the living room, lights off, and watched the evening news lead with the headline, "Teens Calm Defiance Sparks National Debate on Airline Discrimination." Isaiah stared at the screen. His face looked back at him. In that moment, he realized something terrifying and true. He wasn't just Isaiah Lewis anymore. He was now the boy on the plane. 3 days after the flight, Isaiah Lewis couldn't walk down his high school hallway without feeling like his skin had turned into glass. Everywhere he went, someone was watching. Some students offered high fives. Others gave awkward nods. A few avoided him entirely, as if proximity to his story made them complicit, or worse, afraid. He wasn't used to this. Before, Isaiah had moved through the world with the kind of quiet that made people underestimate him. He liked that. He preferred not to be the center of anything. But now the center had moved to him. His phone vibrated every hour. interviews, invitations, requests from civil rights groups, youth panels, and podcasts. Teachers pulled him aside and told him he'd made history. Even his AP government instructor, Mr. Drummond, offered to write him a college recommendation letter for what you've stood for, not just what you've done. Isaiah thanked him, but never followed up, because deep down he felt like he hadn't stood for anything. He had just stood still. He didn't yell. He didn't protest. He didn't even finish the book he brought for the flight. And somehow that had become enough to shake headlines. But inside, it didn't feel like strength. It felt like exhaustion with no end. Meanwhile, Blue Air was spinning. Their first public statement had come quickly. Too quickly. It read like a template. No names, no responsibility, just bland regret and promises to evaluate internal protocol. The backlash was immediate. Evaluate. A child was nearly dragged off a plane for being right. You don't get to neutral your way out of this. Where is the accountability? The apology with teeth? Then came the statement that broke the dam. Malcolm Lewis, Isaiah's uncle, published a scathing op-ed in a national legal journal titled, "Not a Miscommunication, a Mischaracterization of Who Gets to Belong." It wasn't just a legal argument, it was a moral reckoning. He wrote, Isaiah didn't raise his voice, yet he was deemed a threat. He had a valid seat, yet was seen as an intruder. He called for help, not because he wanted to escalate, but because he knew the system wasn't designed to listen until a man in a suit intervened. The article went viral in under 12 hours. Malcolm refused all interviews. He didn't want airtime. He wanted accountability. And in boardrooms across Blue Air's corporate towers, panic began to set in. At home, Isaiah sat in his room, staring at his closed notebook. The blank page in front of him felt heavier than the world outside. His fingers hovered over the pen, but he didn't write. He didn't know how to. Instead, he scrolled through messages he hadn't answered. A mother in Pittsburgh. My son is 8. I hope he's as brave as you someday. A retired pilot from Oregon. You reminded us all why decency still matters. A girl from Chicago. You made me feel like I belonged in places I've been told I don't. He read each one twice, sometimes 3 times, but replied to none. They felt like gifts he didn't earn. Later that night, as he stood brushing his teeth, his little sister knocked on the bathroom door. Zay, yeah? I made you something. He opened the door to find her holding a drawing, him in a superhero cape, standing on top of an airplane. Why a cape? He asked, smiling gently. Because you helped people, she said simply. Even the grown-ups. He looked at her, his throat tightening, then pulled her into a hug that lasted longer than either expected. But while his family embraced the quiet triumph, the airline scrambled behind the scenes. Blue Air executives held an emergency board meeting under pressure from investors and legal advisors. Their stock had dipped 4.7% in 2 days. Analysts were whispering about brand trust erosion. Employees, especially black staff, began sharing anonymous stories about similar experiences with Sandra Whitlow and others like her. An internal whistleblower leaked a chat log. If he just sat where I told him, this wouldn't have happened. That single sentence landed like a grenade. The court of public opinion reached its verdict before the company could. Sandra Whitlow was officially suspended indefinitely, but no termination letter. No direct apology to Isaiah. Just more ongoing reviews and updated training modules tucked behind PR language. It wasn't enough, and the public knew it. That Sunday, Isaiah's mother drove him to a small park near the old railroad tracks. No cameras, no reporters, just grass, air, and the quiet song of leaves overhead. They sat on a wooden bench, sipping sweet tea from a thermos she packed. I haven't told you this yet, Trina said, staring into the trees, but when you called Malcolm from that plane, I wasn't just proud. I was scared. Isaiah turned to her, eyes wide. Why? Because I knew that once you spoke up, you couldn't go back. You can't be invisible again. And sometimes, baby, she paused, her voice catching, it's easier to survive when you are. Isaiah sat with that. He didn't disagree. He looked down at his hands. His palms still remembered how tightly he had held his phone, how hard it had been to speak gently when everything in him screamed to shout. "I didn't want this," he finally whispered. "I know," she replied, her voice warm. "But you didn't run from it either." She took his hand. "And that matters." Later that evening, Isaiah opened his notebook again. This time, the pen moved. He wrote, "I am not brave. I am not a hashtag. I am a boy who didn't want to be erased. They tried to make me small. I stayed still, and the world had to move around me." He didn't post it. He folded the page, slid it into the back pocket of the notebook, and put the book beneath his pillow, like a quiet vow. On a quiet Wednesday morning, Isaiah sat by the window in his school library, earbuds in, eyes drifting across the lines of a textbook he wasn't reading. Outside, the clouds rolled like heavy thoughts. Inside, the whispers continued. He was used to them now. "That's the kid from the plane. My mom said he might be on CNN next week. You think he'll sue?" But this morning, the voice that broke his routine wasn't from a student or a teacher. It came from Malcolm, his uncle, mentor, and, now more than ever, his compass in a world suddenly tuned into his every breath. "Zay," Malcolm said over the phone, his tone graver than usual, "I need you to listen carefully." Isaiah sat upright. "What's going on?" "We got an email last night, anonymous, but detailed, and it's about her, Sandra Whitlow." Isaiah didn't need to ask who. Malcolm continued, "Someone sent us a video, not on your flight, of another one, 2 years ago. Different city, same pattern." Isaiah felt the air shift. She targeted another black passenger, this time a woman, older, quiet, refused her boarding for being disruptive. No footage went viral. No lawyer was called. The woman ended up missing her mother's funeral. Isaiah swallowed hard. "Her name is Ruth Mahoney," Malcolm added. "She's from Charlotte, retired librarian. No criminal record, no complaints in her history. And now, she's reaching out." Isaiah leaned against the window frame, the glass cool to the touch. "I don't understand," he said. "Why now?" "Because you didn't flinch," Malcolm replied, and that gave someone else the courage to come forward. A silence stretched between them, heavy with memory and responsibility. "Zay, she wants to talk to you," Malcolm said gently. "Only if you're ready." Isaiah didn't answer right away, not because he was unsure, but because something deeper was stirring inside him, something like purpose. They met on a quiet Zoom call that evening. The screen flickered for a moment before the image sharpened into focus. An elderly woman in a floral blouse, silver gray locks wrapped in a simple headscarf, and warm, weary eyes. "Isaiah," she said softly. "Ms. Mahoney," he replied, offering a respectful nod. She smiled faintly. "I've been watching your story unfold. I didn't think I'd ever see the day someone made her answer for what she did." Isaiah blinked. "You mean Sandra?" Ruth nodded. "She humiliated me 2 years ago, in front of a crowd that stayed silent. I was flying to D.C. for my mother's funeral. I'd upgraded my seat with points I'd saved for years. I thought it would make the trip easier. But when she saw me at the boarding gate, she paused, her voice catching. She said I was being combative, that I didn't belong in Pitheremium boarding. She said she was concerned I'd be disruptive. Security escorted me out before I could even open my mouth to explain. I never made the flight." Isaiah clenched his fists under the desk. "I didn't speak up," Ruth said. "Not then. Not when the airline sent me a generic apology email. Not when people told me, 'Don't stir things up. You're not the protesting type.' But when I saw your face, when I saw how you didn't move," tears welled in her eyes. "I remembered who I was before I let them make me smaller." Isaiah felt emotion rise in his throat. "I didn't do anything special," he whispered. "You did the hardest thing," Ruth said. "You didn't shrink." The next day, Malcolm filed an official request to reopen Ruth Mahoney's case. Armed with the new evidence and the viral visibility of Isaiah's story, legal pressure began to build. This time, Blue Air couldn't bury it. Within 48 hours, major news outlets picked up Ruth's story under headlines like, "New allegation against suspended flight attendant deepens airline's crisis." From silence to strength, how one teen's courage helped another woman be heard. For Isaiah, the momentum no longer felt abstract. It had a name, a face, a story that could have remained buried. But not anymore. The airline scrambled to respond. This time, their PR team issued a named apology to Ruth Mahoney. They pledged a third-party audit into past passenger complaints involving Sandra Whitlow and similar staff. It was damage control, yes, but it was also a sign. The wall was cracking. Behind closed doors, Isaiah received an invitation to join a private panel with the airline's internal ethics committee. Not for a photo op, not for headlines, for real input on how things must change. He stared at the email for a long time. His mom sat across the table from him, stirring tea slowly. "You don't have to say yes," she told him. Isaiah nodded. "I know. But maybe," she added gently, "it's not just about you anymore." He exhaled, folded the email, and tucked it under his notebook. "I'll think about it," he said. But deep down, he already knew. That night, he wrote again in his notebook. Her silence became a scar. Mine became a signal. Maybe we don't carry pain just for ourselves. Maybe we carry it long enough to pass someone else the light. He paused, then wrote one more line. "Tomorrow, I'll answer." The room was colder than Isaiah expected. Not in temperature, but in tone. Thick carpet, dark wood paneling, a row of microphones and water glasses, cameras positioned like eyes that didn't blink. On the wall behind the dais hung a massive seal, United States Department of Transportation, Civil Aviation Oversight Panel. It was the kind of place designed to make people feel small, but Isaiah had learned how to be still without shrinking. Next to him sat Ruth Mahoney, dignified, composed, her floral scarf tucked neatly around her shoulders. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her glass, but when Isaiah offered his, she smiled. Not in thanks, but in unity. They were both here for the same reason, to tell the truth, to break what had long been left unspoken. The hearing had been fast-tracked. Pressure from lawmakers, civil rights organizations, and the viral explosion of the Isaiah Lewis incident had brought Blue Air and the broader airline industry to national scrutiny. The chairwoman, Senator Angela Graves of Illinois, opened the session with firm, deliberate words. Today's hearing is not about one seat on one plane. It's about a pattern of assumption, of exclusion, of quiet cruelty masked as protocol. Today we listen not just to what happened, but why it keeps happening. A hush settled as she turned to Isaiah. "Mr. Lewis," she said, "you have the floor." Isaiah inhaled slowly, then stood. He looked out across the chamber at senators, aides, journalists, and the blinking red lights of cameras. Somewhere beyond them, he knew millions were watching. Some are rooting for him, some skeptical, some remembering moments in their own lives that never made headlines. He spoke without notes. "My name is Isaiah Lewis. I'm 16. I live in Atlanta. I like poetry. I play chess. And 2 weeks ago, I boarded a plane and was told without any evidence, without being asked, that I didn't belong in the seat assigned to me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't disobey. I simply asked for the truth to be acknowledged, and I was treated like a threat, like I was the one disturbing peace when all I wanted was to be seen as human." His voice didn't waver. He continued, "What scares me most is not what happened to me, but how normal it felt, how prepared I already was for that kind of moment. I didn't flinch, not because I'm brave, but because I knew it could happen. I was taught to be ready." He glanced briefly at Ruth, then back at the panel. "But not everyone is lucky enough to have someone pick up the phone. Not everyone gets filmed. Some people get erased. And if this hearing changes anything, I hope it changes that." Silence. Not of boredom, but of weight. Senator Graves nodded, her eyes steady. "Thank you, Mr. Lewis." Then she turned to Ruth. "Ms. Mahoney, whenever you're ready." Ruth adjusted her glasses. Her voice was soft, but crisp. 2 years ago, I tried to fly to my mother's funeral. I never made it. I was told I was being disruptive, but all I had done was ask why I couldn't board with my ticket. There was no scene, no shouting, just me, standing alone, while a white attendant decided I was a problem. She paused, her hands folded tightly. I didn't file a lawsuit. I didn't post a video. I went home, and I carried that shame with me like it was mine to bear. Her voice cracked, but she pushed through. Until Isaiah refused to shrink. That's when I realized I wasn't just a one-time mistake. I was part of a pattern, and if no one breaks it, it never stops. The room exhaled collectively. Ruth reached out, resting her hand over Isaiah's for just a second. 2 generations, 2 voices, one thread of truth. The aftermath was immediate. Clips of the testimony went viral within hours. Isaiah's final line, "I was taught to be ready," was printed on t-shirts, quoted in op-eds, and replayed by major news anchors. Ruth's words, "I went home and carried that shame," sparked conversations on talk shows and morning radio alike. But perhaps most importantly, change began to form beyond the noise. The DOT released a directive mandating a federal audit of airline racial bias claims from the past 5 years, a required third-party ombudsman on all major domestic flights by 2026. A new training standard titled Bias at Altitude, Human Dignity in Aviation, crafted in consultation with civil rights leaders, airline workers, and passengers like Isaiah and Ruth. Blue Air, facing mounting pressure, announced a $20 million fund to support anti-discrimination reform and passenger education. For the first time, Sandra Whitlow's full employment record was disclosed, revealing 3 previous unresolved complaints of similar incidents, none of which had reached the public. But for Isaiah, none of this felt like a victory lap. After the hearing, he walked out of the chamber, not with cameras chasing him, but with a quiet ache in his chest. It had cost him something, and he wasn't sure what yet. He and Ruth sat together on the steps of the building while staff cleared the room inside. The sun was beginning to dip behind the Capitol dome, casting long shadows. "You did well," Ruth said, her voice steady now. Isaiah nodded. "So did you." She chuckled softly. "I've had 70 years of practice not being heard. Felt good to finally make some noise." They sat in silence for a while. Then Isaiah asked, "Do you think it's enough?" Ruth didn't answer right away, then said, "Not yet, but it's more than we had." A breeze passed through, rustling her scarf. Isaiah looked out over the lawn where reporters and activists were gathering. He knew this wasn't the end of the story, but maybe it was the end of silence. He pulled out his notebook once more and scribbled a line before closing it. History doesn't always start with a roar. Sometimes it begins with a seat that someone refuses to give up. It began with a single headline. Blue Air training audio leaked. We watch for certain profiles. Isaiah Lewis saw it the moment he opened his phone that morning. He hadn't planned to check social media. His mother had gently encouraged a break. But the message from Malcolm simply read, "Turn on the news. Now." Within minutes, every major outlet was replaying the same chilling 43-second audio clip. You won't find this in the manual, but you learn to scan. Look for agitation, mismatched stories, or, certain profiles. Statistically, there are patterns. Sometimes it's easier to move one passenger than to escalate with the wrong type. You mean, unspoken rules, yeah. You'll learn. Just trust your gut. 2 voices. One male, one female. Quiet, casual, as if discussing seat upgrades instead of systemic discrimination. Isaiah felt cold, not angry, not even surprised. Just cold, because this wasn't new. Not really. It was confirmation of what people like him had long known, but had been told they were imagining, that bias wasn't always loud. It could be trained, coached, rewarded, and now it was exposed. By noon, Renark's scan for bias trended worldwide. Protests erupted in major airports. Civil rights organizations demanded sweeping investigations. Airline executives scrambled, and the Department of Transportation released a rare midday statement. If true, this represents not just a breach of trust, but a cultural failure within commercial aviation. But behind closed doors, panic took on sharper edges. The leak, it turned out, came from inside Blue Air. An anonymous employee, now known only as Delta Echo, had sent the clip to multiple journalists, stating in a note, "We've been trained to protect the company, not the people. No more." This is what's said behind closed doors. The clip dated back 8 months. The trainer, a regional manager, is still employed. The trainee who asked, "You mean?" was later reassigned after questioning policy too directly. The fallout was immediate. Blue Air's interim CEO issued a televised address. Her expression was solemn, rehearsed. We are launching a full internal investigation. The training audio does not reflect our core values. But the damage was done, because now the public had heard it for themselves, and they were done listening to apologies. That night, Isaiah sat on the roof of his apartment building, legs dangling over the ledge, the sky pulsing above in thick indigo streaks. He didn't want to talk. Not to Malcolm, not even to his mom. But silence wasn't peace anymore. It was pressure. He scrolled through his inbox. There were messages from people who thanked him for being brave, and others who demanded more. You need to speak on this. Use your platform, Isaiah. They won't listen unless it's you. He felt torn between roles he had never asked to audition for: symbol, witness, spokesperson, teenager. He clicked on a video link Malcolm had sent. It opened with a familiar face. Ruth Mahoney, seated in a modest living room, camera phone balanced on a stack of books. Her voice was steady. When the system trains people to expect the worst from you, it's not a misunderstanding. It's manufacturing bias. I've seen it. I lived it. And now we've all heard it. But this time, we're not going back to silence. The clip ended, and Isaiah knew. He couldn't stay silent either. The next day, Isaiah posted a single video. He sat at his desk. No edits, no music. Just him staring directly into the camera. My name is Isaiah Lewis. You've probably seen my face. Maybe even worn it on a shirt. I didn't ask to be here. I didn't plan to be a part of any movement. I was just trying to fly home. But this recording, it proves what so many of us already knew, that the rules change when your skin does. Those assumptions become policy, that our calm is mistaken for plotting, our presence mistaken for a threat. He paused, exhaled. This isn't just about blue air. This is about every unspoken rule that lets systems function while people are erased. To the employees who risk their jobs to leak the truth, thank you. To the people who stayed silent, ask yourself what you're willing to unlearn. To the kids like me, you were never the problem. I don't know what happens next, but I know I'm not disappearing. He ended the video with a final message on screen. The microphone is on now. What will you say? Within hours, the post had over 5 million views. News anchors replayed it across networks. Op-eds were published within the day. Activists quoted Isaiah's final line during speeches in front of terminals from LAX to JFK. And in response to the wave of outrage, Congress called for a multi-agency review of discrimination in airline procedures, marking the first such inquiry in nearly 20 years. Blue Air had no choice. They announced a full overhaul of their training infrastructure, beginning with a program created in partnership with an independent justice coalition. They called it See Me, Acknowledge and Act, and they asked one person to co-author it, Isaiah Lewis. When the request came in, Isaiah didn't answer right away. He spent 2 days thinking, reflecting, journaling. Then he asked to meet with the internal task force, not in a boardroom, but at a community center near his school. A neutral space, real chairs, no podiums, just people. There, surrounded by airline leaders, advocacy groups, and a few flight crew who had seen both sides of the line, Isaiah spoke calmly. If we're going to change anything, he said, we need to stop teaching people how to manage risk and start teaching them how to recognize humanity. He paused, scanning the room. Don't ask me to make this pretty. Ask me to make it honest. The group nodded, and Isaiah began sketching out a framework that would become the foundation of a new kind of training, not about fear, but about dignity, not about procedures, but presence. That night, as he returned home, Isaiah stood quietly in front of the bathroom mirror. He didn't see a victim. He didn't see a hero. He saw a boy who had refused to step back and had ended up stepping forward into history. And in his notebook, he wrote, "They train people to look for the threat. I trained myself to look for the truth. And maybe that's what justice is. The shift from what they expect you to be, to whom you choose to become." October 17th. The morning began like any other in Atlanta. Humid air softening under the first hints of fall, trees just beginning to let go of their leaves. But at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, the heart of the nation's busiest travel hub beat with a different kind of rhythm that day. It wasn't just another flight on the board, it was Flight 1706. A number chosen on purpose. A message about freedom, not just of movement, but of being seen, heard, and respected. This wasn't a marketing stunt. It wasn't a press spectacle. It was the ceremonial launch of a national initiative now known as See Me, Acknowledge and Act. A bold collaboration between civil rights groups, airline unions, aviation executives, and, most unexpected, a 16-year-old boy who never wanted to be a symbol, but became one anyway. Inside the terminal, a modest stage had been set up near Gate B14. No red carpet, no champagne, just rows of folding chairs, a simple white backdrop with the campaign's name in navy serif font, and two empty first-class seats placed center stage, their headrests embroidered in silver thread, for those who held their ground when told to move, for the children who didn't disappear. People from all over the country filled the room, flight attendants in uniform, community leaders, local students, media, and travelers who had rescheduled flights just to be present. Ruth Mahoney sat in the second row, her floral scarf folded carefully in her lap. When Isaiah Lewis walked onto the stage, the room didn't erupt with cheers. It stood, quietly, as if honoring a moment that didn't need noise to matter. He didn't speak right away. He walked to one of the empty first-class seats and ran his fingers lightly across the armrest, then turned to face the crowd. And with a voice that had been refined through storms, he began. 2 months ago, I boarded a plane with a seat assignment in a quiet plan to get home. I didn't expect attention. I didn't plan for conflict. I didn't raise my voice. But I was raised to know my worth. And when that worth was questioned, I didn't leave the aisle. A lot has happened since then. Headlines, hearings, hashtags. But today isn't about what happened to me. It's about what happens next. This seat, he gestured behind him, was once a place someone told me I didn't belong. But it's never just about the seat. It's about how easily dignity can be denied when bias hides in training manuals, in gut instincts, in the silence of those who know better. So we're changing the manual. See Me isn't just a program. It's a promise that no passenger should need to record their humanity to be treated fairly. That no child should need a lawyer to get to Phoenix. He paused, then looked directly at the audience. We're not perfect. This won't fix everything. But today we start differently. And sometimes that's enough. A breath. Then, I sat still. The world moved. And because of that, someone else will get to keep their seat. The room stood in silence, not from the absence of emotion, but from the fullness of it. Ruth Mahoney dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Across the aisle, two flight attendants reached for each other's hands. A young boy in the crowd, no older than 10, turned to his father and whispered, "That's him, right?" And his father, eyes glassy, nodded slowly. "That's him." After the speech, Isaiah was ushered to a private area behind the stage. He declined all press interviews save one, a quiet sit-down with a student-run newsletter from a local public high school. The student reporter asked him nervously, "What would you say to kids who feel like they don't belong?" Isaiah smiled. "Belong anyway," he said. The SE initiative rolled out across 5 major airlines in that fall, with training sessions co-designed by passengers, legal experts, and flight crew veterans. Isaiah and Ruth were invited to speak at several internal leadership summits, not as keynote speakers, but as contributors to culture. By winter, seat-based complaint tracking protocols were introduced nationwide. By spring, every Blue Air flight included a new closing statement from flight crews, approved by Isaiah himself. Every seat is more than a number. It's a name, a life, a story. And today we thank you for flying with dignity for all. But long before the headlines faded, Isaiah returned to the life he never meant to leave. Back to school, back to family dinners, back to writing, not as performance, but as healing. One afternoon, his little sister peeked into his room, holding a new drawing. This time, Isaiah wasn't wearing a cape. He was just sitting, calm, holding a paper in one hand and a light in the other. "What's that?" he asked. She grinned. "The seat," she said. "You know, your seat." On the first anniversary of Flight 4312, Isaiah visited the same gate at Sacramento International Airport. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't bring a camera. He just sat in the waiting area, quietly watching passengers go by. It's about the systems that are trained to doubt some people more than others. It's about how bias isn't always loud, but it's always there unless we name it, challenge it, and replace it. And more than anything, it's about the courage to stay seated when the world tries to erase you. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from the loudest voice. It comes from the one who stays still long enough for the truth to echo. Isaiah didn't ask for change, but by standing his ground, he became the reason it began. Would you like a Yiswarpuyuri Vietnamese translation of this moral lesson as well? Pho.